Well, good morning, everybody. Glad to see you. I'm glad there are some who know how to set their clocks on a day like today, right? We are grateful that you're here, grateful that you've chosen to gather around this time of craving God, craving Christ, craving love, craving the way we need to live into this relationship with God. We continue this great journey of crave during this season of Lent, and I hope that you're discovering the rich blessing of trying to discover how to sort of put things aside in order to claim what it is God has for you. That's what this Crave series is all about. And so I'm grateful that we can gather together in that light. So today we want to talk about how fasting can claim strength for us. How fasting can give us strength. And it seems a bit ironic, right? And it reminded me of an age-old children's game that my hunch is you played, because I know I did. I loved it when I was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. Do you remember a game called rock, paper, scissors, right? It's fun, right? Rock, paper, scissors was great because you could play it at any time and any place with anybody, right? Because you just needed two hands, right? And most of us have two hands, and most of us have the capacity to play the game. And it was just fun. It was fun because you got to play it with somebody. It was fun because you could even practice by yourself, right? You didn't even have to have somebody. You could just play by yourself, right? You don't need to own up to that, but it was all right if you did it, right? But it was simple, right? 1, 2, 3, right? And rock crushed scissors, and scissors cut paper, and paper covered rock, right? You get the game, right? Why don't you pair up and play a real quick game just right now. Just right now with whoever's right there. Just play it with whoever's right there with you, okay? You got somebody near you. Play it. Yeah? Yeah? Dynamite? Yeah. I see some people making up their own rules. Part of the gift of the game was you could make up your own rules, and you could make up your own punishment for whoever the loser was, right? One of my most fun ones was, man, you slap the arm of the wrist of the person who lost, right? So there was a great sense of power and a great sense that I'd overcome, that I'd achieved, right? And maybe that was the guy in me, I don't know. But so you always wanted to win, right? And you took any way you could to kind of outsmart somebody. You could finesse them. Some people thought it was a game of finesse. Some people think it's just a pure game of chance, right? But we all thought, if I could just win, that was the whole purpose, right? If I could just win, if I could just overcome you, if I could just conquer you, then it was good. And I love the game. I mean, it's fun because adults can play it with children too, right? You don't just have to be a kid to play the game. But I wonder if it's not sort of like this great metaphor for our own lives. Because who of us don't like to win, right? And who of us don't like to sort of overcome, right? And who of us don't mind having just a little bit of power, just a little bit of strength, right? Just a little bit of sense that, man, I can make this happen. And so there's this funny sense in which this might be this microcosm of our own lives, demonstrating how much we love, in fact, perhaps even crave power and strength and self-determination, right? And while there's nothing innately wrong with that, a part of our goal and our desire during this Crave series is to help us claim a different kind of craving, right? A different sense of who am I and how am I? It's why, in fact, we created this whole worship series called Crave, because we wanted to help us move out of a kind of normal, natural human craving into a different kind of godly craving. And so if you haven't already pulled out your worship notes, I just want to encourage you to do so, because the series goal has been from the very beginning for us to discover a craving for God beyond our personal appetites. And our personal appetites can be food, but certainly our personal appetites can be power or authority or overcoming or putting somebody else over, right? We've got all kinds of personal appetites. And so the goal of the series is to help us discover a craving for God beyond any of those personal appetites that we might have. And each week we're going to take a different bent on that. Each week we're going to kind of look at it kind of distinctively. And so this week, today's goal is going to be kind of different as well. So today's goal, if you'll just jot down, is that we want to crave God's power and claim our weakness, because when we do, we become strong. Now, I know that doesn't sound logical, but I want you to just think about this for a minute. When we crave God's power and claim our weakness, we become strong. And the only way that happens is through the illogic of faith. Because there's clearly nothing logical about that, right? Logic would say, let me get stronger, let me get better, let me get more talent, let me get more skill, let me get more ability, let me get more capacity, let me get strong, so then I'm ready to go and I've got my power and I've got my capacity. But faith in Christ tells us a different story. Faith in Christ says, if I crave God's power, God's ability, God's authority, and identify and claim my weakness, then I become strong. Well, because I know this doesn't make any logical sense, I had to call a great authority on this, somebody who can speak to the issue. And you know this person. She grew up in this church, and she, in fact, is kind of a third-generation person, literally in the life of the church. And up until last year, you would have known her as Alyssa Robinson. And Alyssa is on staff here, and Alyssa spent a lot of time growing in faith here. And then a couple of years ago, she met a guy that she really loved and liked and kind of wanted to spend some time with. And so you now know her as Alyssa Shabada. And so Alyssa's going to come speak to us about this illogic of claiming weakness and yet knowing strength. So Alyssa, come on up and share with us a good word this morning. Would you welcome Alyssa? This is kind of out of her comfort zone, and so I'm grateful that she's been willing to come and share a great story. So tell us your story, Alyssa.
Well, you may not know it by looking at me, but I have MS. It started about 4 years ago. One day I got a tingling sensation in my feet, and by the end of the week it had moved all the way up to my waist. And I knew that wasn't right. And so I started going to doctors, and I spent a full year bouncing from doctor to doctor, trying to find someone who was willing to test for MS, because my uncle has it, and his symptoms started very similarly. And so I kept trying to find someone, not that I wanted that to be the diagnosis, but that was one of my big fears, because I'd seen how it had affected his life. And so my hope wasn't that, it wasn't that. So I just wanted to make sure. So I ended up at UT Southwestern, and at the time I lived about 5 minutes away from there, which was perfect, and they were willing to test me. And so I did all of the tests you could think of: spinal tap, ocular nerve exam, CAT scan, MRI, everything. So it finally came to the time that I was to go in and receive my diagnosis. And the day before, my mom called me, and she said, "I want to go to this appointment with you." And I said, "No." I said, "I'm a grown woman. I live 5 minutes away from there. I don't need my mommy coming to the doctor with me. I'm fine." And then at the last minute, I decided, "Okay, Mom, you can come." So thank you for coming. And I'm so glad that I did, because when we got to the doctor's office, he sat us down and he said, "Well, you have MS." And after that moment, I didn't hear anything else. I didn't hear anything else the doctor told me. I was just completely blank and dumbfounded sitting there. And I'm so fortunate that my mom was there, because she had the mind to say, "Okay, what do we do next? What do we do for medication? What does this mean for insurance? What are the next steps?" And ask all the questions that I couldn't even wrap my head around asking. So we left the doctor's office, and my mom was driving, and like I said, I lived 5 minutes away, so she was going to drive me home. And I still hadn't said a word. I didn't cry. I didn't react in any way. I was just sitting there in the car, and she said, "You know what, I'm going to take you home with me." And so my mom drove me back home to Flower Mound, and she knows that I am not a very touchy-feely person. When something happens in my life, I don't like to talk about it. I don't want to hug. I don't want to sit and cry with someone. I just want to seclude myself. I want to be by myself. And so she let me do that, and we went to the house. She went to her bedroom and shut the door, and I was in the living room by myself. And it was in that moment that I just completely broke down. And I cried and I dropped to my knees, and it's like everything from the past year had just piled up on me, the hope that it wasn't MS, and all of these other issues. And I just felt in that moment I had nothing left. And I turned to God and I said, God, why are you doing this to me? Which is a very selfish thing and is very unlike me, because I don't believe that God makes bad things happen to people. I think we live in a world where bad things happen and God makes good out of it. But in that moment, I had just lost everything and I was completely empty and I had nothing left, and my instinct was to turn to God. And in that moment, I felt so much peace and so much reassurance that it doesn't make sense. And that was the darkest moment of my life, but also one of the most precious memories I have, because there was no doubt in my mind that God was in that room with me.
Alyssa, thank you for sharing that story. Yeah, thank you. So, Alyssa, you shared this same story with the staff, this past week. That's why I wanted you to share the story. And so part of what you said was you've been searching for that emptiness ever since. Why?
Mostly because that was just a smattering of emotions, the most joy, the most peace, the most comfort that I've ever felt in my life. And I would love to feel like that every minute of every day, and just know, because I doubt constantly, and that's part of my faith journey, is I'm constantly doubting. But in that moment, just to know without a doubt that God is there would be great to feel that all the time.
Yeah. So how did you know that was God?
Because with all of the bad things that had been happening and all of the sadness that I was feeling in that moment, it did not make sense for peace and reassurance to come to me. And the only way I can describe it is that it was not of this world. There was no, like you said, no logic to it. And so I can only assume that it was divine.
Yeah, that's cool. So I know clearly you would never want that diagnosis again. You'd never like that word again. And certainly I'm sure you wouldn't want that moment specifically so much. But would you be willing to empty yourself again in order to be filled like that?
I would. I would love for it to be by choice. But I want to get back to that feeling, and I've been working to get back to that feeling.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, thank you for sharing your story. Would you thank her again for sharing? Thanks, Alyssa. So Alyssa shares a most profound point, that we really can only find the power of God's strength when we're willing to empty ourselves. And it goes against every normal principle in our own body, thought, feeling, emotion, right? Because most of us want to do it ourselves. I think Paul the Apostle had some great wisdom on this. When he was writing to the church at Corinth in the 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul lays this out when he's talking about our physical body, what Alyssa was literally just talking about. He says, look, we've got this treasure in clay jars, and that treasure is our body. That treasure is our heart and our mind. We have this treasure in clay jars, he said. And the reason for that is that we need to know that that's God's immeasurable power that comes from God and not from us. And so Alyssa points this profound concept out, that emptying or denying or being weak or feeling empty can be a powerful thing if we will allow God to fill us up. That becomes the genesis of fasting, this spiritual practice where we deny ourselves for a period of time for a spiritual purpose. It's why we're fasting during this season of Lent, during what we call Crave. And so there's another biblical example, just like Alyssa's, that comes from an Old Testament book that many of us may not have read, but we perhaps have heard the story of a woman named Esther. Esther is a Hebrew queen in a pagan king's court. She has become the queen in the king's court because he kind of banished his other queen. And she neglects to tell this pagan king that she's a Hebrew. No one knows this but her uncle Mordecai and herself. And at one point, the king is going to create genocide for all of the Israelites in the region. And Mordecai wants to bring this news to Esther so that she, being on the inside, can bring this news to the king and perhaps stop the problem that the king is going to create. And so Mordecai brings a word to Esther, and he tries to help her understand what she needs to do, which is to go tell the king, don't do this. But Mordecai and Esther both know that anyone, including the queen, who might show up in the king's quarters uninvited is susceptible to death. And so they've got to figure out a way to make this happen. So Esther chapter 4, beginning in verse 13, we're going to see how Esther chooses to take up a fast in order to claim the strength that only God can provide. Listen now here, beginning in verse 13, as Mordecai and Esther begin to have a dialogue. So in verse 13, Mordecai told them, meaning these others who were going to inform Esther, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. He's basically saying, look, if you don't go do this, then not only are your Jewish brothers and sisters going to die, but you're going to die. Verse 14, for if you keep silence at just such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise up for the Jews from perhaps another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold there a fast on my behalf. And neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. That's pretty phenomenal, wouldn't you say? Esther orders a fast for herself and for all of the Hebrews for 3 days, both night and day, no food. And the whole concept is that we will set aside ourselves, we will set aside our sustenance, we will set aside our strength, we will set aside our capacity and focus on God. And then God, Esther believed, will give her the strength to do what it is only God can do. Because Esther knew in her heart of hearts, in the belly of her gut, that of her own accord, of her own strength, of her own ability, she would never be able to do that. She would never be able to survive the illegality and the condemnation of the king's authority. But she did believe that if she emptied herself of food through a fast, she would have strength to not only go to the king, but to change the king's mind and to save the Israelite nation. That's powerful. Well, if you've read the rest of the story, you know that's what happens. Esther goes to the king. She persuades the king not to kill the Jews. She remains in his household. She gathers the Hebrews together. They are able to be led by Mordecai, and all is well. But it's really only because, just like Alyssa, she was able to empty herself of self and recognize her utter need for God. But the problem most of us have, myself included, is that we get so filled with stuff, schedules, obligations, things to achieve, things to overcome, family, work, life, all which is normal, but all which can sometimes fill us to capacity to eliminate the ability to relate to a higher power. But fasting claims for us that I'm going to stop something, food, behavior, attitude. And when I stop those things, whatever that is from which I'm fasting, then I'm going to fill myself with the power of God. You see, it doesn't make any logical sense. It doesn't make any common sense. I need to eat for strength. I need to learn these things or do these things for power. I need to get over these things so that I can achieve those things. You see, it doesn't make any logical sense. But neither does dying on a cross so that others might have life. Neither does suffering and death in order that others might have hope. It's called the gospel. Paul would put it this way when he wrote to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 25. He identified it this way: the foolishness of God is wiser than any human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than any human strength. It doesn't make sense, but it is the gospel, good news. And it is the power of fasting. Because you see, fasting causes us to not rely on self, but to rely on the greater power, the greater authority, the greater gift. It's why when I think of fasting, I don't think of fasting, for instance, as about hunger, whether hunger for food or hunger for that ability or hunger for that behavior. I think more of fasting as weakness. And before I lose you, just hang out with me for just a minute. Fasting's not so much about hunger as it is about weakness. And here's the gift with regard to weakness, as your notes indicate. When I am weak, I can become and claim God's strength. You see, when I'm weak, I can rely on the fact that God is with me and for me, and I don't have to recognize that it's my ability or my capacity. In our weakness, we can discover God's strength through the weakness of fasting. Fasting is likewise in your notes there. Fasting is not about emptying, and that's what we tend to think. Well, I'm going to empty my belly, or I'm going to empty my desire for this thing, or I'm going to empty myself out here. But rather, it's not so much about emptying as it is about being filled by God. Because in the emptying of that belly or that heart or that head, when I fast from this stuff, I'm not so much emptying myself as I am filling myself with God's presence and God's power. It's not of our own capacity. That's what Alyssa was attesting to. Was that in her emptiness and in her loneliness and in that weak moment, she experienced, not by her own power, not by her own presence, but the power and presence of God, that she wasn't alone and she wasn't empty and that she would be filled. No, fasting is not about emptying and it's not about hunger. It's likewise not about withholding. This withholding concept goes to that negative stuff we talked about last week. See, to fast is not about penance. It's not about punishment. It's not about withholding. But rather, it's about making room for God. Where I might otherwise fill my craving, whatever it is, now I'm going to fill that craving with God, right? Discover a craving for God beyond our personal appetite. This is the gift of God's presence. This is the gift of what it means to make room through fasting. And when we make room for power, for strength, for capacity. You know, not only did Esther know this, but John the Baptist, do you remember that guy, the funny guy that testified to Jesus? John the Baptist, who paved the way for Christ to come. We're told in John's Gospel, John chapter 3, John said, he, meaning Jesus, he must increase while I must decrease. That's like the fast. If I decrease, then that allows God in me, Christ in me, the power of the Spirit in me to increase my power, increase my capacity, increase my strength. I think it's also what Paul meant when he wrote to the church at Philippi in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, when he said, through Christ, I can do all things. And what he intimates, I believe, in that is, without Christ, I can't do much. But I need him to fill me, to help me I need to make room. I need to make that possible. That's our goal in this season of Lent we call Crave. That we will empty ourselves of self and discover this deep craving for God. And while we do that, we're going to use that craving for God to help other people. I mentioned last week there are two specific goals for us in this campaign of craving. Not only are we to crave God beyond our personal appetites, but because of that, we're also going to help and serve other people. The first way we're going to do that is through the Zip Code Project, and that'll be our local ministry, our local outreach. The Zip Code Project is something that our North Texas Annual Conference is doing, where by the year 2025, in 2 zip codes, we're going to make every effort possible to eradicate poverty in those 2 zip codes. It's a phenomenal task, and none of us can do it by ourselves. But with the power of God filling us, because we've made room for that by emptying ourselves of self, we can achieve this, friends. And the other capacity will be our long-standing relationship with Mission Mozambique, that for the last 20 years we've been offering great hope and power and authority to help raise up a new generation of leaders through the Center of Hope, through the rural hospital, through the providing of education for young students, and through the opportunity to give life where there might not otherwise be life. And here's how we're going to do it, friends. Through our fasting, whatever financial savings we have from the food from which we're fasting, or if we're not saving any money from the specific fast that we're doing, we're going to set aside 1 hour of wages per week, and we're going to donate that to these 2 causes. And we're going to help alleviate poverty, and we're going to bring hope, all because we've made room for God to give us strength for the journey. So I pray this week and next week and the week after, we will indeed discover a craving for God beyond any personal appetite. And so doing, we might find strength and power to do much more than we could ever do ourselves. Thanks be to God, we have that gift. Will you pray with me? Holy and loving God, thank you for the challenge you issue to us of the opportunity to avail ourselves of your fullness, your richness, your goodness. Claim us, God, for that journey, and help give us strength in the days that lie ahead, that we might indeed know your presence and your fullness, so that we might indeed serve you and share your good news with others. Help us, Lord, to fast for strength, your power. For that, God, we give you great thanks. In Jesus' name, amen.